Ethan Martin, a 22-year-old with calloused hands and weary eyes, was no stranger to hard work. Each day for the past few years had been a cycle of relentless labor. By day, he was a warehouse loader, hauling heavy boxes until his back ached. By night, he cleaned offices in a towering skyscraper downtown, pushing his tired body through hours of mopping, scrubbing, and polishing. His life was an endless loop, defined by the need to keep moving, to keep working, and above all, to keep the income steady for one reason: his mother. Ethan's mother, Patricia, had raised him alone after his father left when Ethan was just a boy. She was the center of his world, his guiding star, and his reason for every sacrifice. Patricia had always been a pillar of strength, working multiple jobs to support them both. But now, leukemia was slowly robbing her of her vitality. The once lively, strong woman had become fragile, her face pale, her body weak from the endless rounds of chemotherapy. Watching her suffer was unbearable, but the medical bills were piling up, and Ethan was determined to do everything he could to pay for her treatment. He was trapped in a cycle of debt and exhaustion, fighting a battle that seemed impossible to win. One freezing winter evening, after a double shift, Ethan stood at the bus stop, his body sagging with fatigue. The cold wind bit through his worn jacket, and he shivered, clenching his teeth to keep warm. His eyes stung from lack of sleep, and his legs felt like they were made of lead. He closed his eyes, trying to ignore the ache in his muscles, when he heard the familiar screech of the city bus brakes. Ethan climbed onto the bus, grateful to escape the biting cold. He scanned the crowded interior and, to his relief, spotted an empty seat near the back. He sank into it, letting out a sigh as he finally took the weight off his feet. Resting his head against the window, he tried to relax, but his thoughts drifted to his mother lying in her hospital bed. The image of her frail form haunted him, and he wondered how much longer he could keep up this exhausting routine. His mother's life depended on it, and yet it felt as though every paycheck barely made a dent in the growing stack of bills. Just as he was drifting off, the bus came to a halt at a busy intersection. Passengers shuffled on, filling every available space. Ethan watched absently as they made their way down the aisle, his gaze landing on an elderly woman who seemed to struggle with each step. Her silver hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and she clutched the railing with a hand that shook from age. She looked around the bus, her eyes scanning the seats, but no one seemed inclined to offer her a spot. Most of the passengers were glued to their phones, oblivious to her presence. A pang of empathy stirred in Ethan's chest. He knew what it felt like to be invisible, to be overlooked. Without a second thought, he stood up and gently tapped the woman's shoulder. "Ma'am, you can take my seat," he offered, his voice soft and respectful. The elderly woman looked up, her eyes widening with surprise. For a moment, she simply stared at him, as if she couldn't believe someone had shown her kindness. Then, a small smile broke across her face, and she nodded gratefully. "Thank you, young man," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan helped her into the seat, making sure she was comfortable before he returned to his spot by the railing, gripping it as the bus lurched forward. Standing didn't bother him. He'd stood through many long, grueling shifts, and this was nothing in comparison. The simple act of kindness gave him a sense of satisfaction, a rare feeling in his otherwise challenging life. The bus continued its bumpy journey through the city, stopping occasionally to let passengers on and off. Finally, it approached Ethan's stop near the small, cramped apartment he shared with his mother. He prepared to step off, adjusting his scarf and tightening his grip on his worn backpack. Just as he was about to exit, he felt a gentle tug on his sleeve. Turning around, he saw the elderly woman reaching up to him, her frail fingers grasping a small, folded piece of paper. She placed it in his hand, her touch lingering for just a moment. "Take this," she said softly, her voice filled with an odd sense of urgency. Ethan blinked in confusion, glancing down at the paper in his hand. "What is it?" he asked, but she simply smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes. Before he could ask further, The bus doors close, and it pulled away, leaving him standing on the sidewalk, watching the taillights disappear around the corner. Curiosity tugged at him as he unfolded the note. Written in elegant cursive handwriting was an address: 43 Pinewood Avenue. Beneath it were 5 numbers, arranged in a sequence that looked like a code. 19,726. Ethan frowned, puzzled. He didn't recognize the address, and the numbers didn't make any immediate sense. Was this some kind of prank? Why had she given him this note? Part of him wanted to dismiss it, to crumple it up and forget about it. But something stopped him, a strange feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. As he walked the short distance to his apartment, Ethan turned the note over in his hands, wondering if he should even bother with it. His life was already filled with enough mysteries, enough hardships. Yet, as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the note sat on his nightstand, refusing to leave his mind. He closed his eyes, trying to push the thought away, but it lingered, nagging at him with a quiet insistence. The old woman's gaze, that strange smile. There was something about it that made him feel as though this was not a coincidence. The following morning, Ethan dragged himself through another grueling shift at the warehouse, his mind drifting to the note more than once. Every time he tried to dismiss it, his curiosity grew stronger. The address, the numbers, the way she had given it to him so deliberately, it all seemed too strange to ignore. By the end of the week, Ethan could no longer resist the urge to find out what the note meant. His curiosity had reached its peak, and he felt a restless energy stirring within him, a need to solve this small mystery amidst the chaos of his life. He knew he couldn't continue with this unknown gnawing at him. On his next day off, Ethan dressed in his best clothes, a pair of faded jeans and a slightly wrinkled button-down shirt, and made his way to the bus stop. He clutched the note tightly in his hand, determined to follow its trail. He had no idea what awaited him, but the sense of adventure, of doing something entirely out of the ordinary, brought a faint spark of excitement into his otherwise monotonous life. As the bus rolled through the city, Ethan watched as the familiar gritty streets transformed into wide, tree-lined avenues. The dilapidated buildings and run-down shops of his neighborhood were replaced by stately homes, their manicured lawns and iron gates a world away from the life he knew. He felt like an outsider, a stranger in this affluent part of town. When the bus finally stopped, Ethan stepped off and looked around, feeling a sense of awe mixed with apprehension. Pinewood Avenue was quiet, the kind of street where the air felt still and every house exuded a sense of history and wealth. He double-checked the note in his hand to make sure he had the correct address. And there it was, 43 Pinewood Avenue. The house was enormous, almost mansion-like, surrounded by high walls, and an imposing wrought iron gate that looked as though it belonged to a castle. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the surge of doubt. What was he doing here? This couldn't be right. But the note had led him here, and now, standing in front of this grand estate, he felt a strange pull, as if he had been meant to come all along. Taking a deep breath, he approached the gate and noticed a keypad on the side. The numbers written on the note -19,726 lingered in his mind, a sequence that seemed to beg for use. His hand shook slightly as he reached out and entered the code. With a soft peep, the gate clicked open. Ethan took a hesitant step forward, feeling as if he were crossing into a different world. Ethan stepped through the iron gate with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The grand estate loomed before him, its walls high and imposing, adorned with ivy and surrounded by well-manicured gardens. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The quiet elegance of the surroundings felt surreal, almost as though he had entered another world. He had spent his entire life in the gritty corners of the city, in narrow alleys and cramped apartments, never imagining he would find himself standing in a place like this. The walkway led him to a broad staircase with polished stone steps, which seemed to beckon him forward. As he climbed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was intruding. What kind of woman had he met on the bus, and why had she directed him to this mansion? The closer he got to the large oak door at the entrance, the more questions bubbled up in his mind. He paused for a moment, unsure if he should knock or turn back and dismiss the whole experience as a strange encounter. But his curiosity was relentless. There was something compelling about the old woman's note, the mysterious address, and the way she had slipped it into his pocket with that knowing smile. It was as though she had known he wouldn't be able to resist the pull of the unknown. Ethan raised his hand and knocked gently, the sound echoing through the quiet. For a few seconds, there was only silence, and he started to worry that he might be trespassing. But then he heard faint footsteps approaching. The door opened slowly, revealing an older man in a crisp black suit. He looked at Ethan with mild curiosity, his gaze shifting to the note clutched in Ethan's hand. "May I help you, young man?" the butler asked, his voice formal yet polite. Ethan cleared his throat, feeling slightly embarrassed. I'm not sure. I met an elderly woman on the bus, and she gave me this note with this address," he said, holding out the paper as though it might explain everything. The butler's eyes softened, and he nodded as though understanding completely. "Ah, that would be Mrs. Turner. Please, come in. She's been expecting you." Expecting him? Ethan's confusion deepened, but he followed the butler inside. The interior of the mansion was breathtaking. Polished marble floors, intricate chandeliers, and walls lined with beautiful artwork. Ethan felt out of place, acutely aware of his worn clothes and scuffed shoes in such an opulent setting. He kept his gaze low, afraid to accidentally bump into anything that looked priceless. The butler led him through a hallway and gestured toward a cozy sitting room with a large bay window that allowed the sunlight to stream in, illuminating the room in a warm golden glow. As Ethan entered, he spotted the elderly woman from the bus, Mrs. Turner, sitting in an armchair by the window. She looked just as frail and delicate as she had on the bus, but there was a warmth in her eyes that hadn't been as visible before. "Ah, Ethan," she greeted, her voice soft and welcoming. "I'm so glad you decided to come. Please, have a seat." Ethan sat down cautiously, still unsure of why he was here. Mrs. Turner smiled, studying him with an expression that seemed both kind and wise. "I must have surprised you on the bus," she said gently. "I imagine a young man like you doesn't encounter too many mysteries in his daily life." Ethan nodded, feeling a bit awkward but curious. I just wasn't expecting any of this," he admitted. "You gave me this address, and I didn't know if it was some kind of mistake. I'm sorry if I intruded." Mrs. Turner laughed softly, a sound like the rustling of leaves. "No intrusion at all, dear. In fact, I had hoped you would come. You see, there was something about you that caught my eye on the bus. You showed kindness without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. That is rare in this world, Ethan." He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure how to respond. He hadn't thought much of offering his seat. It was simply the right thing to do. Yet Mrs. Turner's words made it sound like a profound act. She leaned forward, her gaze intent. "Tell me, Ethan, do you believe that kindness has its own rewards?" Ethan thought for a moment, then shrugged. I think that sometimes people just need a little bit of kindness. Life's hard enough, you know." Mrs. Turner's eyes sparkled. "Yes, life can indeed be hard. But sometimes kindness is like planting a seed. You never know how it will grow or what it might become." She reached into a small box beside her chair and took out a folded envelope, holding it out to him. "This is for you, Ethan. I want you to take it and open it when you get home. There's something I'd like you to do for me, if you're willing." Ethan took the envelope with a puzzled expression, feeling the weight of it in his hands. "What is it?" "It's an opportunity," she replied cryptically. "A way for you to change your life, and perhaps the lives of others." Her words left him even more bewildered, but there was a sincerity in her tone that made him trust her, even though he didn't fully understand. He nodded, sliding the envelope into his pocket, feeling its unfamiliar shape pressing against him. "Thank you," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure for what. Mrs. Turner reached out and placed a gentle hand on his. "No, thank you, Ethan. You reminded me of something important, that compassion and selflessness still exist in the world. Now, go home and open the envelope when you're ready." The butler reappeared at the door, ready to escort him out. Ethan stood, glancing back at Mrs. Turner, who offered him a warm, encouraging smile. As he walked back through the mansion's grand hallways, his mind swirled with questions. What could be in the envelope? What could Mrs. Turner, a wealthy stranger, possibly want from him? And why had she chosen him, of all people, for this mysterious task? The ride back to his neighborhood felt surreal. He replayed the conversation over and over in his mind, trying to decipher the meaning behind her words. By the time he reached his apartment, he was both mentally and physically drained, but the envelope weighed heavily in his pocket, a constant reminder of the strange encounter. Sitting down on his bed, Ethan took a deep breath and pulled the envelope from his pocket. His fingers trembled slightly as he carefully tore it open, revealing a handwritten note and a cashier's check. His eyes widened as he looked at the amount, a sum that was more than he could earn in a year. The note read, "Dear Ethan, if you are reading this, you have already taken the first step in a journey that I hope will change your life. I see a spark in you, a kindness and resilience that reminds me of my late husband. He was a man who believed in helping others, and it's a legacy I wish to continue. I want to give you a chance to lift yourself from the burdens that weigh you down. This check is for you, but there's a condition attached. Use part of this money to pay off your mother's medical bills, but I ask that you also set aside a portion for others who may need it, those who, like you, work tirelessly but find themselves struggling. In my youth, I was once in a situation much like yours, and someone reached out to help me when I had nothing. I promised myself that if I ever had the means, I would do the same for someone else. You are that someone, Ethan. All I ask is that you pay it forward when you can. Be the light for others, just as you have been for me. Sincerely, Margaret Turner." Ethan sat in stunned silence, the check and note slipping from his hands onto the bedspread. He couldn't believe it. This wasn't just help, it was a lifeline, a chance to start over, to free his mother from the crushing weight of debt and illness. And more than that, it was a request for him to become something greater, a reminder of the power of kindness. For a long while, he sat in silence, absorbing the enormity of what he held in his hands. The image of Mrs. Turner's gentle smile lingered in his mind, and he realized that this wasn't just a gift. It was a responsibility, a promise that he would one day help others as he had been helped. With a newfound sense of purpose and gratitude, Ethan whispered to himself, "Thank you, Mrs. Turner. I'll make sure your kindness lives on." The weight of the check and Mrs. Turner's note lingered with Ethan as he sat on his bed, still trying to process everything that had just happened. In his hand, he held a piece of paper that could change his life, a chance to free himself from the relentless cycle of work and debt that had kept him trapped for years. The check was substantial enough to cover his mother's medical bills and still have some left over, but it was the note that resonated even more deeply. Mrs. Turner's words were both a blessing and a charge, to lift himself up, and when he was able, to help others in the same way. He found himself reading her letter again, absorbing the meaning behind every sentence. Mrs. Turner had chosen him, not because of anything he'd done or asked for, but simply because he'd shown a moment of kindness on a crowded bus. The realization struck him with a powerful sense of humility. How many others were out there, working just as hard, dealing with struggles that went unseen by the rest of the world? That night, Ethan didn't sleep. Instead, he lay awake, thinking of all the possibilities that had suddenly opened up before him. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to dream. He imagined being able to pay off his mother's medical bills, to finally see her free from the cold, sterile hospital rooms that had become a second home. He imagined bringing her to a small, peaceful place, somewhere green and quiet, where she could recover without the weight of debt hanging over their heads. As the first rays of dawn filtered through his window, Ethan sat up, his heart pounding with determination. He knew what he had to do. The check was more than he'd ever held in his life, but it wasn't just for him. Mrs. Turner's words echoed in his mind, urging him to not only lift himself up, but to pay the kindness forward. He decided to start by making an appointment with the hospital's billing department to settle his mother's outstanding medical expenses. Ethan put on his best shirt, a simple button-down that had seen better days, and carefully folded the check and Mrs. Turner's letter, placing them both in his pocket before heading out. There was a spring in his step that hadn't been there in years, a sense of purpose that gave him the strength to hold his head high. When he arrived at the hospital, the receptionist directed him to the billing office, where a tired-looking woman with glasses perched on her nose greeted him with a faint smile. Her desk was covered with stacks of papers and files, the endless accounts of patients burdened by the high costs of healthcare. "Good morning," Ethan began, his voice steady but tinged with nervousness. "I'm here to settle my mother's medical bills. Patricia Martin. She's been undergoing treatment here." The woman adjusted her glasses, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she pulled up Patricia's account. "Ah, yes. Patricia Martin. I see here that there's a substantial balance due, along with upcoming costs for continued treatment." Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the pressure of Mrs. Turner's gift in his pocket. "I'd like to pay off everything she owes," he said, the words feeling almost surreal as they left his mouth. The woman looked up, surprise flashing across her face. "Are you certain? That's quite a large amount." "Yes, I'm sure," Ethan replied, feeling a swell of pride. "And I'd also like to cover her treatment for the next few months." The woman's eyes softened as she processed the payment, her expression shifting from shock to admiration. "You know, I don't often see family members willing to go to such lengths," she said quietly. "Your mother is very lucky to have you." Ethan smiled, thinking of Mrs. Turner's note. "Actually, I'm the lucky one," he murmured, more to himself than to the woman. With the bills paid, Ethan left the hospital feeling lighter than he had in years. The relief of knowing his mother would receive the care she needed without the looming shadow of debt was overwhelming. He walked through the city streets with a renewed sense of hope, noticing things he hadn't seen before: the warmth of the sun, the laughter of children in the park, the vibrant colors of the flowers lining the sidewalks. But Mrs. Turner's request still weighed on him. He had kept his promise to care for his mother, but there was more he could do. He thought of all the people who, like him, were fighting battles in silence, working long hours, struggling to make ends meet. There had to be a way to make a difference, to use this unexpected blessing to honor the kindness he'd been shown. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by the familiar hum of the bus as he waited at the stop to head home. As he boarded, he noticed an elderly man struggling with a handful of grocery bags. The man looked frail, his hands shaking as he tried to find a seat. Without hesitation, Ethan stepped forward and took one of the bags, guiding the man to a nearby seat. "Thank you, son," the man said, a look of gratitude in his eyes. "It's hard to find a little help these days." Ethan nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest. "It's no problem at all." They sat together for the remainder of the ride, chatting about the city, the changing weather, and the simple pleasures of life. The man shared stories of his youth, his career as a teacher, and the pride he felt in seeing his students succeed. Ethan listened with genuine interest, feeling a connection to the man's words, to the legacy of kindness that Mrs. Turner had passed on to him. When the bus reached Ethan's stop, he helped the man with his bags and bid him farewell. As he walked home, he felt a sense of purpose growing within him, an idea taking shape in his mind. Over the next few weeks, Ethan began reaching out to people in his community, friends, neighbors, and acquaintances who were facing their own struggles. He organized small acts of kindness, helping a single mother with her grocery bills, covering a classmate's bus fare, and buying a meal for a homeless veteran he saw on the street corner every morning. With each small gesture, he felt closer to honoring Mrs. Turner's wish, to creating the ripple effect she had spoken of. One evening, as he returned home from one of his 2 jobs, he found a letter waiting for him in his mailbox. The envelope was crisp and unmarked, the handwriting unmistakably Mrs. Turner's. With a mixture of excitement and curiosity, he opened it, unfolding the letter with careful hands. "Dear Ethan, I am proud of you. Word has reached me that you have been using your gift to help others in the community, and nothing could make me happier. Kindness is a rare currency, and it is a gift that keeps on giving. I knew when I met you that you had the heart to make a difference, and it brings me great joy to see you fulfilling that promise. There is one more thing I'd like you to know. I have set up a foundation in your name, the Ethan Martin Foundation, dedicated to supporting young people who are struggling to find their way. It is my hope that this foundation will allow you to continue your work on a larger scale, to help those who, like you, need a hand in difficult times. You may not understand it now, but you are part of something bigger than yourself. You are the legacy I wish to leave behind, a reminder that kindness and compassion can change lives. Remember, you don't have to do it all alone. There are people who will support you, who will join you in your mission to make the world a better place. With all my love and gratitude, Margaret Turner." Ethan sat down, the letter clutched in his trembling hands. A foundation. In his name. The enormity of the gesture was overwhelming, a testament to the faith Mrs. Turner had placed in him. She had given him not just a gift, but a responsibility, a path that extended beyond himself and into the lives of countless others who would benefit from the kindness he had been shown. He felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes as he looked around his modest apartment. For so long, he had struggled just to keep his head above water, to survive from one day to the next. But now, he had been given the chance to build something meaningful, to reach out and lift others as he had been lifted. In that moment, Ethan made a promise to himself and to Mrs. Turner. He would honor her legacy. He would carry forward the gift she had given him, ensuring that kindness would continue to ripple through the world, one person at a time. The Ethan Martin Foundation became more than just a name on a piece of paper. It became his life's work, a mission that filled his heart with purpose and joy. And as he looked forward to the future, he knew that he would never again feel alone. For Mrs. Turner's kindness would live on in every life he touched. Ethan sat in his modest apartment, staring at the letter Mrs. Turner had sent him. The Ethan Martin Foundation. Even the name felt surreal, like something out of a dream. He couldn't shake the disbelief that a woman he had met by chance on a bus had not only seen potential in him, but had taken steps to ensure that his life, and the lives of others, would change forever. It was an act of kindness that seemed unfathomable in its scope, and it weighed on him in the best way possible. The next morning, Ethan woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. For years, he had barely been able to see beyond the demands of each day, only focused on how he would get through another shift, another night with just a few hours of sleep, another month of rent payments. But now, he felt like he was standing on the edge of something bigger than himself, a chance to step into a new life, a life where he could give back in ways he had only ever dreamed of. The first order of business was meeting with the attorney Mrs. Turner had mentioned in the follow-up letter attached to the foundation documents. Ethan put on his best clothes, the same button-down shirt he had worn to the hospital when he paid off his mother's medical bills. He still felt a little out of place in anything other than his work uniform or casual clothes, but he squared his shoulders and reminded himself that he was here for a purpose. When he arrived at the attorney's office, he was greeted by a friendly receptionist who led him into a polished conference room with a large mahogany table and leather chairs. The attorney, Mr. Harris, entered shortly after Ethan sat down. He was a tall, distinguished man with salt and pepper hair and an air of quiet confidence. As they shook hands, Ethan noticed the warmth in Mr. Harris's eyes. "Ethan, it's a pleasure to meet you," Mr. Harris said, gesturing for him to sit. "I had the privilege of working with Mrs. Turner for many years, and she spoke very highly of you." Ethan flushed slightly, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. "Thank you, sir. I'm still trying to process all of this." Mr. Harris chuckled softly. It's not every day that someone finds themselves at the head of a foundation, especially one with as meaningful a mission as this one. Margaret, Mrs. Turner, believed deeply in the power of giving people a chance to rise above their circumstances. She saw that potential in you, Ethan, and she wanted you to have the tools to extend that opportunity to others. As Mr. Harris spoke, he slid a folder across the table, filled with documents and information about the Ethan Martin Foundation. Ethan opened it cautiously, scanning the paperwork that outlined the foundation's goals, structure, and funding. There was even a letter from Mrs. Turner, detailing her vision for the organization. In it, she had written, "Dear Ethan, this foundation is my final gift to you, but it's also a gift to everyone whose lives you will touch. My hope is that the Ethan Martin Foundation will become a beacon of hope for young people who, like you, are working hard but struggling to make ends meet. I believe in you, Ethan. Use this opportunity wisely, and remember that every small act of kindness creates ripples that spread far and wide. I know you'll make me proud. With all my love and faith. Margaret Turner." Reading her words brought a lump to Ethan's throat. She believed in him, not only to take care of his own life, but to create something that could uplift others. He looked up at Mr. Harris, determination now solidifying in his heart. "I want to make this work," he said. "I want to honor Mrs. Turner's vision." Mr. Harris nodded approvingly. "Then let's get started. We have a lot of work ahead, but I'll be here to guide you every step of the way." They spent the next several hours going over the legal and logistical aspects of running a foundation. Mr. Harris explained the importance of creating clear goals, establishing a board of trustees, and reaching out to community organizations that could help connect the foundation with individuals who would benefit from its support. It was overwhelming, but Mr. Harris's calm and experienced guidance reassured Ethan that he wasn't alone in this endeavor. As they wrapped up their meeting, Mr. Harris handed Ethan a business card. "If you ever have questions, don't hesitate to call. Mrs. Turner entrusted you with this responsibility for a reason, and I'm here to make sure you succeed." Ethan left the attorney's office with a mix of excitement and trepidation. The foundation was real. This was happening. He felt a sense of responsibility heavier than anything he had ever known, yet it was balanced by an unshakable hope. In the following weeks, Ethan threw himself into the work of building the foundation. He learned about nonprofit management, reached out to community leaders, and started forming a small team of people who shared his vision. Each new task felt like uncharted territory, but he pushed forward, motivated by Mrs. Turner's belief in him and his own desire to help others. One of his first initiatives was to set up a scholarship fund for young adults who wanted to pursue vocational training. He knew that not everyone had the means or desire to attend a four-year college, and he wanted to give people the opportunity to learn practical skills that could lead to stable jobs and careers. He also organized small grants to help struggling families cover emergency expenses, from medical bills to essential repairs. But as the foundation began making an impact, Ethan faced new challenges. Some people doubted his ability to lead, questioning why someone with his background would be in charge of such a large operation. He encountered skepticism from some of the wealthier donors he hoped to bring on board, who couldn't see past his humble origins. Others accused him of only caring about those who shared his struggles, unable to see that he genuinely wanted to uplift everyone in his community. On days when the criticism felt overwhelming, Ethan would sit in his small office and reread Mrs. Turner's letters. Her words reminded him of the reason he had started this journey, the promise he had made to himself and to her. Each time he felt his resolve wavering, he thought of her, picturing the warmth of her smile and the trust she had placed in him. Slowly, he learned to let the negativity roll off his back, focusing instead on the positive change he was creating. One evening, as he was leaving the foundation office, Ethan was approached by a young woman who looked about his age. She wore a worn coat and held a small child's hand, her eyes tired but hopeful. She introduced herself as Rachel and explained that she had heard about the foundation through a friend. She had recently lost her job and was struggling to pay for her daughter's medication. "I didn't know where else to go," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard that maybe you could help." Ethan listened attentively, his heart aching as she shared her story. He saw in her the same desperation he had once felt, the same weight of responsibilities and fears that he had carried for so long. Without hesitation, he assured her that the foundation would provide the assistance she needed. He filled out the necessary paperwork with her, and as they finalized the support grant, he saw tears of relief in her eyes. "Thank you," she murmured, clutching his hand. "You don't know what this means to us." As Ethan watched Rachel and her daughter walk away, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. For the first time, he truly understood what Mrs. Turner had meant by creating ripples. This small act of kindness, this moment of support, would not only help Rachel and her daughter but would echo forward, possibly inspiring them to help others in the future. It was the beginning of something beautiful, a legacy of compassion and resilience. Over the next few months, the Ethan Martin Foundation continued to grow. It became a haven for those who had been overlooked by society, a place where people could find hope and dignity. Word spread throughout the community, and soon, other foundations and organizations reached out, wanting to collaborate with Ethan and support his mission. One day, as he was reviewing the foundation's annual report, Ethan received a letter in the mail. It was from Mrs. Turner's lawyer, informing him that she had left him a small property, a cottage in a quiet part of the city. The letter explained that she had hoped it would serve as a retreat for him, a place to recharge when the weight of his responsibilities grew too heavy. Ethan visited the cottage that weekend. It was a modest but charming place, surrounded by trees and overlooking a small lake. As he stood on the porch, he felt Mrs. Turner's presence, as if she were there with him, guiding him with her steady, gentle hand. This cottage, this sanctuary, was yet another reminder of her endless kindness. That evening, he sat by the lake, reflecting on the journey he had taken. He thought of the boy he had been, a young man struggling to survive, burdened by responsibilities and barely able to dream of anything beyond the next day. And then he thought of who he was now, a man empowered, driven, and humbled by the chance to make a difference. Ethan closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek as he whispered into the cool night air. "Thank you, Mrs. Turner. I promise I'll keep this going. I'll keep your kindness alive." As the Ethan Martin Foundation grew, so did its reach and impact on the community. What had started as a single act of kindness had blossomed into a force of change, touching lives in ways Ethan had never imagined. Each new success felt like a testament to Mrs. Turner's vision and a reminder of the immense responsibility he had inherited. But with growth came new challenges, and Ethan soon found himself navigating the complex world of nonprofit management, public expectations, and personal sacrifice. One afternoon, Ethan was preparing for a fundraising gala that the foundation had planned for months. This event was crucial. They needed additional funds to expand their scholarship program and emergency grants. The gala was set to bring together community leaders, business owners, and potential donors, and it was Ethan's first time hosting an event of this magnitude. His nerves were frayed. Despite his progress, he still felt out of place among the city's wealthy and influential. He worried that his background would somehow be a barrier, that people would see him as the young man who had once worked long hours at a warehouse and cleaned offices at night, rather than as the leader of a growing foundation. But whenever doubts crept in, he remembered Mrs. Turner's faith in him. She hadn't seen his past as a hindrance, but as a source of strength. The gala venue was elegant, with tall windows that let in the golden light of the setting sun, illuminating tables draped in fine linens and decorated with fresh flowers. Guests arrived in formal attire, exchanging polite greetings and admiring the venue. Ethan had barely had time to take it all in. He was busy ensuring that everything was running smoothly, but when he looked around, he couldn't help feeling a swell of pride. This event was a testament to how far the foundation, and he, had come. As the evening wore on, Ethan took a deep breath and stepped onto the small stage to address the crowd. The chatter subsided, and hundreds of eyes turned to him. For a moment, he froze, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. But then he remembered why he was there: to speak for those who couldn't, to share his story and inspire others to help make a difference. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you all for being here tonight. I can't begin to express how much your support means to me and to the countless people we are trying to help." The Ethan Martin Foundation started as a simple idea, a response to a single act of kindness. But it has grown into something that I believe is truly capable of changing lives. He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I didn't come from much. In fact, I spent years working 2 jobs just to make ends meet. I know what it's like to feel like the world is stacked against you, to wonder if there's any way out. But then, one day, a stranger on a bus showed me kindness. She saw something in me, something I hadn't even seen in myself, and she gave me a chance." Ethan felt his voice catch, but he pushed forward. "That woman was Mrs. Margaret Turner, and because of her, I'm here today. She believed that one act of kindness could create ripples that reach far beyond a single person. And tonight, I'm asking each of you to join me in creating those ripples. Together, we can make a difference for people who, like me, just need a chance to rise above their circumstances." Applause filled the room, warm and genuine, and Ethan felt a rush of relief and gratitude. He had done it. He had shared his story in a way that honored Mrs. Turner's legacy and the Foundation's mission. As he stepped down from the stage, several guests approached him, offering words of encouragement and pledging their support. Among the guests was a woman named Amelia Brooks, a well-known philanthropist who had supported numerous charitable causes in the city. She was an older woman, elegant and poised, with silver hair styled neatly and a warm, open expression. She extended her hand to Ethan, her gaze filled with admiration. "Ethan, that was one of the most heartfelt speeches I've heard in years," she said, her voice kind and sincere. "You're doing something truly remarkable here." Mrs. Turner chose well. Ethan smiled, feeling a deep sense of validation. "Thank you, Ms. Brooks. It means a lot to hear that, especially from someone with your experience." She studied him thoughtfully. "Tell me, what's next for the foundation? How do you envision it growing in the future?" Ethan hesitated, taking a moment to collect his thoughts. "Well, right now, we're focusing on expanding our scholarship program and emergency grants. But eventually, I'd like to open a community center, a place where people can come for job training, financial counseling, and even basic necessities like food and clothing. I want it to be a place of support and hope." Amelia's eyes lit up. "A community center. That's an ambitious goal, but I believe you can do it. I'd love to discuss ways I could help make that dream a reality." Ethan felt a surge of excitement. "Thank you, Ms. Brooks. I'd be honored to have your support." As the gala came to an end, Ethan felt a sense of accomplishment he had rarely known. The evening had been a success, raising more funds than he had anticipated, and the foundation now had new allies who believed in his vision. But even as he celebrated, he knew that his work was just beginning. The road ahead would be long, filled with challenges and sacrifices, but he was ready. Over the next few months, Ethan threw himself into his work, channeling every ounce of energy into expanding the foundation's reach. He met with city officials to discuss potential sites for the community center, consulted with financial advisors to ensure the foundation's stability, and worked tirelessly to build partnerships with local businesses. His days were long, but each step forward brought him closer to his dream. But as the foundation grew, so did the demands on Ethan's time. He found himself working late into the night, neglecting his own well-being and barely finding time to see his mother. Friends invited him to gatherings, family members asked to catch up, but he always declined, convinced that every spare moment had to be devoted to the foundation. He was driven, yes, but he was also afraid. Afraid that if he slowed down, he would lose the momentum he had worked so hard to build. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, buried in paperwork, his phone buzzed with a message from his mother. She had sent him a simple text. "Don't forget to take care of yourself, Ethan. You're doing great, but don't lose yourself in the process." He stared at her message, feeling a pang of guilt. She had always been his biggest supporter, cheering him on even from her hospital bed. And yet, in his pursuit of success, he had distanced himself from the people who mattered most. He realized then that he had to find a balance. The foundation was his purpose, but it couldn't be his entire life. Mrs. Turner had wanted him to live, not just work. Taking his mother's words to heart, Ethan decided to start making time for himself and his loved ones. He reconnected with old friends, spent weekends with his mother, and even took a few days off to recharge. It was difficult at first. He felt a constant pull back to his work, but he soon realized that he was more focused and effective when he allowed himself moments of rest. As he found a rhythm, Ethan noticed that his passion for the foundation only grew. He was no longer driven by fear or the need to prove himself. He was fueled by love for his mother, for Mrs. Turner, and for the community that had supported him through his darkest days. He began to understand that success wasn't just about the size of the foundation or the number of lives it touched. It was also about the integrity and joy with which he approached his work. One afternoon, while he was visiting his mother, she took his hand, her eyes filled with pride. "Ethan, I don't think I've ever seen you this happy," she said softly. "Mrs. Turner would be so proud of you." Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "I think I finally understand what she meant, Mom. She didn't just give me a chance. She gave me a purpose. And now I get to share that purpose with others." As they sat together, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He had spent so long fighting to survive, to escape the hardships of his past, but now he realized that his struggles had prepared him for this journey. He was no longer the young man burdened by life's difficulties. He was a leader, a beacon of hope for those who needed it most. The community center opened a year later, a bright and welcoming space filled with classrooms, a food pantry, and job training facilities. Ethan stood at the entrance during the grand opening, watching as families, individuals, and volunteers filled the halls. He could see the gratitude and hope in their eyes, and he knew that every sleepless night, every sacrifice, had been worth it. Amelia Brooks, who had become one of the foundation's most steadfast supporters, approached him with a proud smile. "You did it, Ethan. You turned Mrs. Turner's dream into reality." He nodded, emotion thick in his throat. "I couldn't have done it without her, or without everyone who believed in this mission." As he looked around, he thought of Mrs. Turner, the elderly lady on the bus who had seen potential in him when no one else had. She had given him a gift, not just of financial support, but of belief. And now he was passing that gift on, creating ripples that would carry her legacy forward for generations to come. The grand opening of the community center was just the beginning. Over the next few months, the Ethan Martin Foundation's community center became a bustling hub of hope and resilience. People from all walks of life came through its doors. Young adults eager to gain job skills, single mothers looking for support, struggling families who needed access to basic necessities, and elderly residents seeking companionship and purpose. Each day brought new faces, new stories, and new reminders of why Ethan had dedicated his life to this mission. Ethan often walked through the center, observing the activities and taking time to talk with those who had come seeking help. It was in these quiet moments that he truly saw the impact of the foundation's work. He would hear someone share how they had found a job through the employment training program, or how the food pantry had helped them feed their children. Every success story, every smile, and every heartfelt thank You reminded him of Mrs. Turner and her incredible legacy. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan arrived at the center to find a young girl, no more than 7 or 8, sitting on one of the benches outside. Her face was smudged with dirt, and she held a tattered backpack tightly against her chest. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Ethan approached her gently, crouching down so they were at eye level. "Hi there," he said, offering a warm smile. "My name is Ethan. What's yours?" The girl hesitated before mumbling, "Sasha." Ethan nodded, noting her shy demeanor. "It's nice to meet you, Sasha. Are you here with someone?" She shook her head, and Ethan felt a pang in his chest as he realized she was alone. "Well, you're always welcome here. This is a safe place, and we have lots of people who would love to help you." Sasha looked down, fidgeting with her backpack straps. After a few moments of silence, she spoke in a soft voice. I just wanted to find somewhere warm." Ethan's heart ached. He knew that children like Sasha were part of the reason he had built the community center, to provide a haven for those who had nowhere else to turn. Without hesitation, he offered his hand. "Come on inside, Sasha. Let's get you something warm to drink and a snack. How does that sound?" She looked up at him with a mixture of relief and disbelief, as though she wasn't used to kindness from strangers. Tentatively, she took his hand, and they walked into the center together. As they entered, one of the volunteers, an elderly woman named Grace, noticed them and hurried over. Grace had been with the foundation since the early days, a retired school teacher with a heart of gold. Ethan gave her a nod, and she immediately took Sasha under her wing, leading her to the kitchen area for a hot meal. Watching them, Ethan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The community center was fulfilling its purpose, not only in providing physical resources, but also in offering compassion and dignity to everyone who walked through its doors. It was a living, breathing embodiment of Mrs. Turner's legacy and of the principles she had taught him: kindness, respect, and the belief that everyone deserved a chance. Over the next few weeks, Sasha became a regular at the center. Ethan learned that her family was going through hard times, with her mother working multiple jobs to make ends meet and her father no longer in the picture. Sasha's school was nearby, and she would often come to the center after classes to wait until her mother could pick her up. The staff and volunteers welcomed her with open arms, and before long, she became like family. One evening, as Ethan was finishing up some paperwork, Sasha approached him with a small, folded piece of paper. She handed it to him shyly, her cheeks flushed. "I made this for you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan unfolded the paper and saw a crayon drawing of himself, standing next to her and smiling. With the words, "Thank you," Ethan scrawled in large, uneven letters. A lump formed in his throat as he looked at the simple yet heartfelt drawing. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures held the deepest meaning. "Thank you, Sasha," he said softly, feeling overwhelmed by her kindness. "This is the best gift I've ever received." As the days turned into months, the community center continued to thrive. Ethan was constantly working, brainstorming new initiatives, and finding ways to improve their programs. But as the foundation grew, so did his sense of responsibility. The demands on his time were greater than ever, and he often found himself caught between managing the foundation's operations and directly connecting with the people he had set out to help. One day, Amelia Brooks, the philanthropist who had supported the foundation since the gala, invited him to lunch. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes and the weight he carried on his shoulders. "Ethan," she began gently, as they sat in a quiet corner of a local cafe, "I think you're doing something remarkable. You've turned this foundation into a lifeline for so many people, but I also see how much you're carrying. You can't do this all on your own." Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know, Amelia. I feel like if I take a step back, everything might fall apart. I owe it to Mrs. Turner to keep this going, to make sure it succeeds." Amelia smiled kindly, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. Mrs. Turner chose you because she saw your strength and your heart. But even she knew the importance of surrounding herself with the right people. You've built something incredible, Ethan, but it's time to trust others to help carry the load. Her words resonated with him. He realized that in his desire to honor Mrs. Turner's legacy, he had been afraid to relinquish control, afraid that he might somehow fail her memory if he shared his responsibilities. But Amelia was right. No one could build something great alone. That night, Ethan stayed late at the community center, reflecting on Amelia's advice. He thought about all the people who had been there from the beginning. The volunteers, the board members, and the countless individuals who believed in the Foundation's mission. He knew it was time to let go, just a little, and trust that others shared his dedication. The next day, Ethan called a meeting with his staff and board members. He opened up to them about the pressures he had been feeling and expressed his desire to bring in additional leadership to help manage the Foundation. To his surprise, everyone was supportive, offering to take on more responsibilities and suggesting people they could bring in to strengthen the organization. It was a humbling moment for Ethan, realizing that he didn't have to bear the weight of the Foundation alone. In the following months, the Foundation continued to grow, but this time, Ethan wasn't doing it all himself. He had a team of dedicated leaders by his side, each one committed to the mission and empowered to make a difference. Together, they launched new programs, expanded the community center's resources, and even opened a satellite center in another part of the city. Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that he was no longer just one man with a mission, but part of a movement that extended far beyond him. One evening, as Ethan was leaving the community center, he noticed a familiar figure standing by the entrance. It was Grace, the retired teacher who had befriended Sasha and who had been one of the center's most beloved volunteers. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft, "I just wanted to thank you. This place, it's changed so many lives. I've seen people walk in here with nothing and leave with hope, and I know that none of this would have been possible without you." Ethan shook his head, humbled. "No, Grace, it wasn't just me. It was all of us. Everyone who believed in this mission. Everyone who showed up day after day." Grace smiled knowingly. "Maybe, but it takes a special person to start something like this, to believe in it when no one else does." As he walked away that night, Ethan felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He knew that he had fulfilled his promise to Mrs. Turner. He had created something lasting, something meaningful. Her legacy lived on in every person who walked through the center's doors, in every life that was touched by the Foundation's work. Years later, as the Foundation celebrated its 10th anniversary, Ethan stood in front of a crowd of supporters, staff, and community members, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of Mrs. Turner, of her kindness on that fateful bus ride, and of the ripple effect she had created with one simple act of compassion. Looking out at the crowd, he felt a profound sense of peace and gratitude. The Ethan Martin Foundation had become more than just a nonprofit. It was a family, a beacon of hope for all who sought it. And as he spoke to the audience, he knew that Mrs. Turner's spirit was there with him, proud of the man he had become and the difference he had made. He ended his speech with the words he had often whispered to himself on difficult days, words that had come to define his journey. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change a life. And sometimes, it has the power to change the world. As the audience rose to their feet in applause, Ethan felt a warmth in his heart, a sense of fulfillment that nothing else could match. He had honored Mrs. Turner's legacy, not only by building a foundation, but by creating a community of compassion, resilience, and hope. And in doing so, he had found his own purpose, a purpose that would carry him, and her legacy, forward for years to come.